We're talking about computation and computational thinking today. I'm Tom Vander Ark. You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast, and we're joined today by a repeat guest, Conrad Wolfram, the CEO of Wolfram Research, the author of The Math's Fix. Conrad, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, very nice to be back.
We ran into each other in the hallway at South by and vowed for the reunion to discuss what's right and wrong with math education in the world. You and I have shared careers in the information age where the nature of computational power available to human beings dramatically increased. And it transformed our lives, the way we live and work. It didn't, however, transform the math expectations that we have for young people. We continue to torture young people with hand calculation. We're going to talk about that, but since we recorded our last podcast and since you published The Math Fix 4 years ago, the world has changed and that computer age ended. And I would argue we started a new age of human-computer interaction where we are interacting with reasoning and creation engines, number one, with a new level of power and sophistication. And number two, we're doing it primarily through natural language. The user interface for human-computer interaction is changing. I'd love your take on this, on the frontier and what's happened, and have we really shifted to natural language, and is natural language an adequate interface for the sort of complex problem solving that you, Wolfram, have been really world leaders in and for the last 30 years? Where are we? What's happening?
Yeah, it's very interesting, really interesting question. I agree with you. I'm talking AI age. So, I don't know where we are exactly, but it's a new industrial revolution, probably the fastest moving in human history, and one that's very quintessentially human in the sense that these industrial revolutions were about kind of brawn rather than brain. This one's clearly in the latter category. And so that feels very personal in a sense. In terms of the interface, my observation is twofold. I think we have had natural language interface before in a way, but in slightly different ways. So of course, in a sense, search was something where we started using natural language again much more than we had before. The back end of that was it was much less sophisticated, and we were changing our language, so it wasn't very natural. Back in 2009, we launched our Wolfram Alpha, and the idea there was to get essentially computations done using pretty much natural language. Now I think what we've got is a far more natural interface to something that feels more humanistic coming back, but has all sorts of problems associated with that, some of which may get ironed out. Now, one observation I would make is that I think through history, we've often got new interface types, or they become prevalent, like what was called WYSIWYG, I guess, is windowing and so forth. I think typically they've added to previous interfaces more than got rid of them. So, for example, we still type, and I think we will still, by the way, go on at some level, but at a lesser level, typing syntactic code, even though we have windowing, because the windowing stuff works very well in a set of cases and expands how we can interact with the technology. But I don't think it's the whole story in every case. So I think there are two or three things to disconnect or to slice differently. I think there is our interface, is it natural language? Is it very abstract? I think there is a role going forwards for, as there has been going back hundreds of years, for abstract representation to get precision and to be able to take a lot of different effects and turn them into the same, in a sense, representation. I think that will remain a very important piece of how we make decisions, solve problems, and how we make progress. But there's an interface to that, potentially, of linguistics to set that up. There are many things we'll do linguistically that we would have had to be very deliberate about before. And then there's also the back end of how the linguistics work. And one thing I've said about the Wolfram Alpha interaction versus LLMs, like ChatGPT, is that if they were human, LLMs are sort of the end of the spectrum. They interact very nicely with the other humans, and they have a very nice form of words. It isn't necessarily accurate. Wolfram Alpha is more the Aspergic end of the spectrum. We are fact-based and we're very definite and accurate. We're not always the best at communication. And actually, it's been very exciting to see how those two have been put together to sort of make best of both worlds, a bit like a police drama.
So you're definitely a believer that when it comes to attacking problems, it appears that a mix of these models is best. What does that mean for the interface? Can we rely increasingly on natural language, or will we continue to use abstract languages, the language of math and the language of Python, the language Java? Will we continue to use those languages, and how and when are they going to be useful?
So I suppose my belief is the following, that at some level of complexity of describing computational ideas, you need an abstract representation. And so somewhere in there, yes, I think we need computer languages. But, computer science and the like, which people have gone crazy over, and understandably over the last number of years, has all been about humans writing by hand that language. And I think a lot of that is going to dissipate. Different forms of AI, including the Wolfram Alpha and including things like LLMs, writing code, which we may explicitly see or may not explicitly see, but we may sometimes by hand have to edit that code. In the advanced cases, we may want to do something with it. There may be things we want to understand. It may just be cleaner for us to look at the code, to understand it, and to work with it than to speak English. I mean, you can discuss lots of problems in English, so to speak, and you can get various advantages from discussing them using math notation. You can get precision. You can get the fact that a biological effect and a physics effect and several other effects end up being the same abstraction, even though they didn't look like it. And that gives you tremendous power, because then you can use the same process of getting to an answer that you've developed for that abstraction to go forwards. So I think this idea that somehow, we can just speak within precise human language and it'll sort of, we'll just replace all the abstraction that we've built up over hundreds of years, I think is inaccurate. What I do think is we've got a much wider use and convenience of natural language. Sometimes we'll explicitly need the abstraction, but in fewer cases, they'll build on each other. And one thing about languages, by the way, so we have our own Wolfram language, which is a very high-level language. One of the disadvantages, traditionally, is that we have 6,500 or so built-in functions. So that's vastly more than a Python. What we find with humans is when they've learned the vocabulary to a reasonable extent, the speed of interacting with this language is vastly better than with Python. And also it represents their thought processes much more directly, because they've got many more structures and words to represent what it is they're saying. A bit like we've ended up with in human languages, having a large vocabulary so we can very directly get to a meaning. So roll forward to LLMs and other AI writing code. And of course, the optimization you're looking for is a bit different, because the amount of vocabulary doesn't really matter. The LLMs can easily handle that. So we're getting very interesting ability to write very rapidly, particularly our Wolfram language code, and get very short pieces of code, which are a very nice abstraction from which humans can do their interactions that are useful still to do.
There's an interesting parallel here around content knowledge in domains and industry verticals. You remember when search became popular 15 years ago, there was a education that we don't need to learn content anymore because you can just Google anything. It now appears as we more regularly use a language interface, our task shifts to editing and curating creation. That content knowledge, as well as the knowledge of abstract language, task of editing, of creating quality prompts and editing for better answers, does require both content knowledge and the knowledge of abstract languages. And I think we're seeing content experts making better use of the tools. Do you buy that?
Yeah. I mean, this is very much what I said and continue to say in different domains, which is, when you've got new technology, new machinery, what's the human role? Well, the human role that succeeds is to zoom up a level. So instead of pulling the levers on the ground level, you're pulling the envelope of the thing that changes. I mean, you see there's a lot of machinery. I mean, like, when you drive your car, you're not literally changing the fuel mixture. The car is figuring that out. You are commanding the car to do something at a higher level, to accelerate or brake, or even not that now. You're just telling it to go from A to B and perhaps it's driving itself. So that's the kind of thing I think we want here. We're more like we're zooming up to be the CEO of the process rather than necessarily the expert on the ground. But of course, being a CEO is quite difficult for several reasons. I mean, one is that I describe this quite a lot actually in the Maths Fix about maths, because I always think it's a very interesting take on somebody like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, that they've got this kind of zoom up, zoom down issue. That you've got to be able to go and look at, the future of handheld communicators has touch screens. That's a very big strategic piece, and we're going to combine everything into one unit. And then at the other end, it's like, I'm obsessed with rounded corners. It's got to have this radius of the corner, to make it feel right. So there's this kind of ability to get the big picture so that you're heading in the right direction and zoom into certain details that help you get precision and get the right answer. And that's very hard. Not that, even very successful people like Steve Jobs and people hadn't necessarily always done this right. And that's a facility that I think humans need to get better at, and is harder the more automation you have.
So maybe summarize where we are, particularly in regards to education. We're at this new era in time where we have a powerful set of tools now available widely to learners in high school as well as at the university level, which allows them to take on far more complicated problems than a young person could have done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and actually deliver value to their community. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. And the learning they need and the bit that they need to contribute to that changes quite a bit. And it's very easy to see why this is, and also perhaps why it's gone wrong in people's thinking a bit, particularly with regard to math. So, I mean, math, this is in a sense what I would count as one of the world's most successful problem-solving systems. And what's completely supercharged that beyond imagination is the fact that we have machines that do the bit of that was the most troublesome and hardest. So for hundreds of years, math was great, but in the end, the bit you got stuck on was taking the abstract question, turning into the abstract answer by hand. That was the limitation. And so we developed all these very clever systems for being able to do that with the minimum of calculation. In fact, I had a friend of Alan Turing, the inventor of computers, who was one of my math teachers. And he had a very nice saying at the time, which was, math is the art of avoiding calculation. And he was right. That's what a lot of it was about. But in the last, decade, that's been utterly turned on its head to the point where calculating is incredibly cheap. And so what we now have is where we can calculate pretty much as we want. And the question is, what is it we want to calculate? How are we setting out the problems to a point where we can effectively use the system of maths to get an answer that's real? And how do we not get fooled by the result of that? Because the more complicated the problems are, the messier the problems are, the more likely it is we're going to get fooled by having not defined them properly. Because they're ever more complicated. They're not easy problems to see whether we got the right answer. So those are the steps that are important. Now, by the same token, and I think it's where it's really exciting in education, a lot of students get turned off by math in particular when it gets apparently very abstract. Usually in most jurisdictions, late primary, like they're starting to solve quadratic equations. Like, okay, why on earth do I need this? What is exciting now is we can throw them hard problems that seem like problems they might care about in their life, but seemed like they had nothing to do with math, because in the past they didn't, because they couldn't use it to get a better answer. But now they can. But what they need to know is a much wider range of the tool sets that they could deploy on us, when they deploy them, how it goes wrong, when the computer blows up, whatever it is. Some of the example problems said things like, here's a stage of the Tour de France bike race or whatever. How can you go faster? Right, let's look at all the parameters. Let's look at a card model. Let's look and see whether we understand whether, air resistance and where you're angled to the wind, or whether it's rolling resistance to the bike, whatever it is. Let's try and understand which of those it is, and let's try and model it, put the maps data in and see what it means for a stage, et cetera, et cetera. These are hard, messy problems, but I think they're amenable for, many of our 12 to 15-year-olds in that case. So that represents real experience, or at least some educational version of that, so to speak, but much closer to real experience than we're doing at the moment, and actually pushing the problem-solving skills that I think both more exciting to many students, but also is definitely more relevant to their lives.
So I think you've spotted two problems here with how we currently conceive of math education. One is that we give students problems, even complex problems, but we give them the problem rather than inviting them to find and frame the problem, because I think problem finding, opportunity recognition is more important than ever. And then we spend at least a third of our time, maybe half of our time in some grade levels, teaching them this toolbox of hand calculation to solve a given problem. Let's shelve the problem finding. Why are we still teaching hand calculation? Is there any value to long division and factoring polynomials and multiplying fractions?
Is there any value to learning the pluperfect subjunctive of ammo in Latin? Well, there's some value to it, but I wouldn't force everyone into it, and I think there are better things you can do. What's happened here in the end is I think two things. I suppose the overarching problem in most places in the world is that we have got assessments that tie down subject change. And you can see how this works. And math is right at the top problem end of this spectrum, because it's more important, in quotes, because, our AI age all depends on more math people. Everybody's pressing more math, but we haven't got enough tech people. Math is the central thing, etc. It's also very accessible with numbers. I can mark two scripts and they all both come out with 56. So apparently it's incredibly, deterministic. So that means that if you want to try and say, not how do we get people better grades with the existing content, but actually the content is off base, you've got a huge ecosystem to shift. And that's from, people wanting to get into college. The schools don't want to have to get people past the assessments. So that's in a sense the overarching failure of incentive framework, or the reverse incentives that we've put. And I think one of the big questions going forward, not only for math, but for all subjects in this AI age, as the outside world changes, is how are we going to get rapid subject evolution in education that matches the real world? I think another thing sort of underlies this a bit, which is connected, particularly in the US actually, is this problem of the difference between the essence of the subject that we're trying to get to and the mechanics of the moment that we're doing. And one of the way I describe this sometimes is saying, I'm quite keen on photography, still photography. And when I was at school, I did stuff on photography seminars and I loaded films into cameras, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think if we had photography as a mainstream subject, we'd still start the first lesson with how do you load a film into a camera? Even though that was the mechanics of the moment, has nothing much to do with the essence of photography as I would see it.
We've seen people say, well, let's just stop teaching algebra and we'll teach data science, which is a dumb, crude. You and I are both very much in favor of teaching algebraic reasoning, of multivariable problem solving. The problem I see is that we're giving kids problems rather than inviting them to find and frame problems where they'd actually learn to identify the variables and to set up a problem. And then we're teaching hand calculation rather than modeling complex systems. So we're teaching the wrong algebra in the wrong way, emphasizing hand calculations. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I would perhaps characterize it not necessarily differently, but coming in from a different angle. I mean, I think the problem is when you say algebra, let's say equation solving, you got to really look into the details of what it is you're talking about. So let's say, one of the things you might be trying to do in an equation is say, right, we've got an effect we want to model, and we want to model it so we get a better answer to what to do. What's the best tool set to use for that? Now, question one, is this a thing that's very amenable to machine learning? Or is it something where traditional algebraic, equation solving would really help us in this? Or is it some other of the bazillions of tool sets there are? So that's question one, which, by the way, we don't do at all in schools, and is catastrophic. Question two is, okay, let's say we've decided that equations is a good way at least to do round one of this. Okay, so then there are there are differential equations, there are algebraic equations of all different orders, etc., etc. Let's set the equation up that best matches what we think the problem is. Let's not worry about how to calculate it initially. Let's just set it up. And it may come out as a horrific looking equation, but it doesn't really matter because we've got nice computers who'll solve it. So we have some older techniques, so to speak, that we can now do on computer, but we did have those available before. So it's not, and a lot of the curriculum comes from only having the older techniques. So the algebra is all linked to the techniques we had 100 years ago. So it's not that those techniques are irrelevant, but you'd use them differently. You'd use them in different circumstances. You'd use more complicated versions of them, and you don't need to do them by hand. But you do need to know they're there, and you need to know they're an option. So to me, this dichotomy we have, particularly in the US, between data science, algebra, is completely false.
No, I think that's true. This has almost been conflated with the reading wars, where there's a lot of interest now in teaching explicit phonics. And that aligns with the science of reading as we understand it today. But I think there's some people that are conflating that with mathematics and assuming that the teaching of hand is equally important.
That's a really important point. I'd like to, and that's happened, that particular mistake has been confused by a few people, like, for example, in the UK government. So I just want to make very clear one key difference there. I think most people listening to this agree that people need to be able to read. That's a function. Literacy is a function we can all agree is an outcome we need. And writing in the sense of being able to compose things. So the question then becomes, how do you best get people to that point? And I don't know all the science of it and the phonics and so forth, but that is a mechanism potentially for achieving that. And as I say, I don't know the pluses and minuses, but that's what you're trying to do. We can agree on the outcome, more or less. The problem with math is we're not agreed on the outcome. So that's where conflating the phonics argument with the math reform argument is completely false.
The two objections that I hear about hand calculation, one would be related to the editing issue that we talked about earlier, that students will need it to be able to edit the work of a computer. I think that's a dumb argument. But the other one might be that we both value computational thinking, and that teaching some of these hand calculations might boost computational thinking. Do you buy the argument that for either editing or for boosting computational thinking, that there's some value in teaching that protocol?
There are just much better ways to do it. And there are negatives of doing it the way it's done, right? So, I mean, it's a bit like the Latin argument. Is it useful to learn Latin in order to learn English? Well, yes. Is it the right thing to do? Maybe not, but it's don't start from the proxy. One of the problems right now we've got a huge number of ways to solve the problem, which we can do because we've got mechanized calculating. So a lot of the computational thinking that we actually need is understanding enough about the way the tools operate and what sort of outputs we could expect in order to pick the right set the problem up correctly. The other thing I want to mention with this is a mistake that is very prevalent and where we're actually literally training people to do the wrong thing. And I think one of the things we've got to understand is there is a computational thing that I'm incredibly passionate to have happen. It's related to the traditional math, but it's a sort of a different take on it. It's a bit like, as I've said, I think I described in my book, if you learn to drive a horse and cart, it's not the same as driving a car. I mean, it's sort of related vaguely, but you'd neither start from that point, nor would you think that that's what most people should do in order to become competent car drivers. It's just the wrong way in, and it's the wrong way of thinking in many cases, and isn't really hitting the same skills.
So I do want to be clear for our listeners that you and I are arguing not for less math, actually for more math, for more computation, for more computational thinking. We want young people to engage in more rigorous problem solving earlier, so that we can take on more significant challenges and begin contributing at an earlier age. So this is not a less math argument. This is a more math argument, but it's taking advantage of the computational power that we have and learning how to use it at an earlier age. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. And more than one of the things, one of the things I've often said is in the age in which we're entering, the sort of, I don't know how you want to describe it, intellectual, conceptual is becoming the same as the vocational or the practical. Here's what I mean by that in some sense. Anything that is highly procedural will be done by a machine. So if what you're training people to do is basically turn a handle, you're out of luck in terms of their capability of using that usefully. I mean, a good example of this is science. Has science become conceptually simpler since, the advent of computers? No, absolutely not. It's got conceptually harder because there are more options for what you can do. You can go up to, there are more things you can possibly think because you've got the machinery by which you can do them. And so this is exactly the problem we've got. We've got to go up a level, and it's actually harder, more conceptual thinking than the traditional math, which has in fact, more and more been turned into procedural hand turning.
Yeah.
Honestly, maybe it wasn't supposed to be that, but actually has become that with the way in which assessments work. So no, I am very much, as you exactly laid out, we need a more highly conceptual, more highly intellectual mathematics, which, by the way, will be more practical for real problems. And just to put this completely nail it, and many maths people don't like me saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Before computers, math wasn't that useful for many pieces of real life. It was good for accounting and it was good for bits of physics on which it has succeeded well. It was pretty useless for bits of biology. There was no data science type things, modeling social systems. None of that worked. Now it does at some level. And the reason for that is because we have mechanized calculating. If you strip that mechanized calculating out of education, you are stripping almost all the context for which we want people to learn this mathematics in the first place.
And every job with a family wage or better incorporates mathematics and computational thinking all day long, every day. Right. Every day, every task, you're developing probability distributions. You're trying to model a complex system, either doing that formally or informally. Every job is now computational. If you want to be a biologist or a geologist or a lawyer, every one of those jobs is computational at its foundation. These are critical skills for everyone. So, Conrad, when you wrote the Math Fix, I had big fingers crossed. I thought it would change the world, that everyone would quickly change their math learning expectations and that we'd begin assessing in a new and better way. Not much of that has happened. Teachers are still trapped in a system with dated math expectations. How do we fix this?
Well, I wish I had the full answer. I think, on the ground in places like the US, the UK, not much has happened. Although I think the mood music has in fact changed more than one might think. Now that's a precursor, and I think several things have helped with that. I mean, hopefully my book has helped, but also I think AI, the last year of sort of LLMs has helped. And it's funny how it's helped, right? Because, and it may also hinder as well to some extent. When we released Wolfram Alpha in 2009, people said, some of the teachers said, "Oh my gosh, you can do integrals by, on a computer." And we were going, what we were excited about was the natural language, which we thought was really exciting. The integrals, which, you can do through Wolfram Alpha, we've been able to do for like 20 years by then. So, it's all very exciting. Pleased you're excited about that. But, that's not the new thing from our point of view. But that somehow pushed the idea that this was available. And I feel like the AI LLM revolution of the last year has pushed the idea that, oh my gosh, all our subjects in school might be wrong. We need to actually change what we do, not just how we teach it, although there's been a lot of that too. And so then that's come back to pushing, oh my gosh, maybe math is wrong. So one of the things I've been saying lately is we've had a 30-year run up to math, in the sense that the outside real world reality of it is we're teaching in schools and we kind of screwed it up. We haven't moved it. We better not make the same mistake for the rest of AI, right? Because it's going to affect history and everything.
I couldn't agree more. But at the big air show recently, about a third of the apps I saw were just automating bad instruction, including
Yeah.
hand calculations and math. So this is all well intentioned, but it is trapped in bad policy linked to dated expectations.
Yeah, and I don't know there are various ways to hit at this. I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is go around the world for countries that are interested to do something early. And we've had a few of those do some into this, which is sadly, I wish, I wish there would be a state in the US or.
What about Singapore? We've historically respected them for math education. Any chance you seeing a smaller country flip?
Well, I think a smaller country, yeah, not through Singapore. The issue of Singapore, I'm not as much of a fan there as one might think. I think they have done very well in their social structure how to teach. I think they're teaching the most sensible end of traditional math, and they're doing it in a way that works, at least in their culture, fairly well. I don't see them doing particularly revolutionary content. So I think they've got a lot of pedagogical sophistication.
What about the apprenticeship pathways in Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia? Do you see those incorporating more relevant math expectations?
Not yet in those countries, but I do think the sort of those sort of vocational directions are incredibly powerful. I think as we're questioning in most countries exactly what universities are doing and whether everybody needs to be going to traditional colleges in the way they are, and whether there are new versions of that are happening. I think there are some really exciting things happening, both with new universities and with sort of different tracks that people are on, where it's like, we're not buying this traditional thing. One of the things that drives this in many countries is university admission, is college admission. And it's frustrating because many colleges come to us and say, it's totally screwed up. The people we're getting, who've got top grades often, can't do anything useful when they get here. And we have to retrain them. And then, by the way, can you help with the retraining? And we say, but look, guys, if you could all get together in a jurisdiction and complain at once, we could get the schools often to move. It's a different mechanism in each jurisdiction. But there is a mechanism by which that could happen often. But it's hard to corral them together to have a big enough voice to make schools then adjust to a different thing to do. I do think there is some progress in this, but that would be this sort of top-down approach for trying to get some of this to happen.
Conrad, this became very real for me. Last night, we're coming home from a school concert, and my granddaughter said, "Papa, we're doing this long division in school, and it seems so dumb to learn long division. What do you think about that?"
Okay, so she's off on a good track.
Well, she really put me on the spot. And I feel like a lot of kids and teachers are in that same, between a rock and a hard spot where the typical gateways in school and gateways to college are still gated by these really dated expectations and assessments. So we have work to do.
We do. I mean, I think in a funny way, ways these things turn on their heads sometimes. I mean, the assessments in many places are becoming so sort of devalued in different ways that I think there are options for, in a sense, other currencies, which give, I think, open some possibilities.
Yes, there's many states that are adopting a new portrait of a graduate, and in some cases, they're creating new diploma pathways. And I think that's going to be the key opening, is to create new diploma pathways that are linked to high wage, high demand employment. And I think we'll be able to create a fast values computational thinking and assesses it in new and better ways. And I'm hoping that once a handful of those openings are created, that we'll be able to flip the system.
Yeah, one thing just to add quickly, I think that, as you say, AI for pedagogy rather than changing the subject is quite prevalent. But I would say our early experiments with computer-based math content are quite exciting in terms of having AIs help to teach and tutor and assess much more open-ended computational thinking and math. And I was a bit skeptical how well this would work, but it turns out that the framework we've built for helping teachers to understand how to teach this is actually very helpful for getting AIs to help to teach it. And I'm actually rather positive, because one of the impediments we've had is, I mean, amongst the other ones we talked about, is how would you roll this out with the traditional, with the current teaching workforce, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think there is some great assistance to that now coming down the track. I think AIs will help correctly deployed for that purpose.
Conrad, we so value your advocacy, not to mention the sort of computational power that your family has brought to the world. I want to urge everybody to pick up a copy of the Maths Fix if you haven't read it already. And for a quick fix, check out computerbasedmath.org. That's still a good resource?
That's still a good resource. So I've got some blog posts people might enjoy on conradwolfram.com as well.
We will include a few links to those. Thank you. We'll include a link to our friends at South Fayette Schools just outside of Pittsburgh, are another great example of a U.S. school district that has a beautiful computational thinking framework K through 12 that they developed with Carnegie Mellon. So around the edges, we're seeing people rethink computation in large part because of your work and your advocacy. So thanks for being with us, Conrad.
Thanks. It's great to talk again, Tom.
Thanks to our producer, Mason Pasha, and the whole Getting Smart team for making this possible. Until next week, keep learning, keep leading, and keep advocating for computational thinking. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.